Well, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Steph Schofran. Steph's been in IT for 15 years and has been doing projects in the social networking sort of space since that time. In fact, his first project was a website for FA Carling, and where he was using Fast, which is a search engine that's just been acquired by Microsoft. He's really in a very good position to tell us a little bit about social networking. We're all familiar with social networking as it applies to our private life. So how are organisations using it to be more effective?
Thank you, Simon. So what I really want to look at today is really give you an introduction to what I see as the basics of social computing. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on that because, as Simon said, hopefully we're all familiar with them from how we use them in our social life. But really what I want to concentrate on is what is the value to an enterprise of these social computing elements. And I want to look at it from a couple of perspectives. How is it useful inside the firewall? So for employees, how can an employee gain advantage and an enterprise get value out of using them inside the firewall? And also look then outside, so to their consumers and to their partners, how can we get value out of that? And also look at the considerations for if you are going to do this, what are the considerations for the technology platforms? And lastly, touch on some futures and conclusions. Start by asking, who here considers themselves a baby boomer? So apparently you shouldn't get this. This shouldn't make any sense to you. So I don't know if you want to leave now and just kind of like hang your hat in, but strangely, it's kind of who would consider themselves a Generation Y, and you're probably not paying attention if you're looking at your mobile phone or twittering or whatever at the moment. So this is the sort of stuff that hopefully means a lot to you, and you're the next generation. I don't know, I find it quite strange that actually it's the baby boomers are the ones that should be using this technology because they've got their knowledge to share with the Generation Yers. If you've got questions, feel free to put your hand up. I may defer them towards the end because we are recording the audio tonight. But if it's a critical question, then kind of put your hand up and our address. Otherwise, we can have a discussion and Q&A towards the end. I'm going to give a really quick introduction to a company I work for, Avanade. You'll certainly have come across our parent organisations, Accenture and Microsoft. So I've got a very big slant in terms of my technology adoption in the Microsoft platform. We're a relatively large organisation and have presence globally in about 61 locations, spread geographically across about 25 countries. We've got approximately a $1 billion revenue. So the basics of social computing. Most of you should be familiar from using a lot of the tools of how this kind of technology has evolved over the past 10 or 15 years. You can really trace the evolution of these social computing back to the early bulletin boards, which had their instigation before I started even getting involved in computers in a serious perspective. But it's kind of grown up since then. And one of the ways that I like to think about this whole social computing is really changing the internet and the use of these computers from being a one-way street where we've got information pushed down to us to more of a multi-way street or roundabout where we can get on board and start sharing and collaborating information with each other. So what is social computing? Is it a set of related technologies that can help people connect, share ideas, or is it that people themselves are becoming the computing units and sharing information with them? I don't think there's a particularly clear and definitive response to that at the moment, but if you look at what are the qualities of a lot of the social computing applications that are out there at the moment, they tend to have multiple authors. They're very free in that respect that anyone should be able to use these applications and contribute to them. They're not exclusive. They may have security, but in general they've got a very open ethos to them. In general, they're going to work at decreasing social distances between people to help you find and make connections with people that you may not have had before. They're generally very open from a feedback and perspective, so they encourage commenting or ratings to be placed upon them, and they generally tend to be the sorts of things that will let you subscribe to changes to them so that you can keep yourself up to date with changes in whatever the application is doing. If we look at it from a functional point of view, I've kind of split this into a four-way landscape. Content, which is areas where ideas can be submitted and generated. And things like blogs and wikis we're all familiar with. Things like social media, so the YouTubes of this world and the Flickrs of this world that let us upload and share videos or photographs with our friends. The communication side of this allows us to share and subscribe to the content, and also looping in things like unified communications so that we can get a more immediate connection point to the generator or colleagues within the content area. Community, the building the community aspect of it, in terms of being able to profile the users and provide information about yourself, such as your interests, your age, your hobbies and your skills, and then being able to do social searches, which is to find other people based on a number of criteria. And then finally, that commentary aspect, so being able to do ratings, commenting, tags, social bookmarking and so forth. So that's the kind of boundaries that I think we find ourselves in. If we look at how this pertains to the enterprise, most of us will be familiar with the Web 2.0 as a concept that was coined by O'Reilly at their Web 2.0 conference. Within enterprise, there's a concept of Enterprise 2.0, and social computing has a part to play in this. It has and works with things like SOA, so business services being exposed and provided within the enterprise, either using things like WSDL or REST-based services for being able to build mashup type applications that can consume data from a number of different sources, either within or outside of the enterprise. You then have things such as rich internet application technologies that allow for a much more compelling and dynamic user interface than the old static-based HTML forms-based interfaces that were the prevalent of the earlier Enterprise 1.0 type applications. And they're using technologies such as Ajax and Flash or the Microsoft Silverlight technology to really give a more dynamic, responsive and productive experience. And that's quite important for an enterprise, because if it's a slow, unresponsive user interface, it's not going to get traction and it's not going to be popular with the workforce. And then finally, the social computing aspect generates content via its interactions with communities such as wikis and blogs. So let's turn and look at what the social computing aspects that can exist within the firewall and look at some of the areas where potentially we can get some value out of them. So let's pick 3 areas that I want to touch on here. Where's the value? Where can we actually get some real monetary value or revenue or displace some existing cost out of the enterprise? What are the policies and governance that we should be putting in place around these technology sets? And then lastly, how can we measure the success of these technologies within the enterprise? So there's a couple of things that I often hear when I start talking to people about social computing. The first one is these Generation Y and millennial people. And people say that if you don't start implementing these kind of social computing aspects within the enterprise, you haven't got a hope in hell of attracting that new workforce into your company. And whilst there might be a little bit of truth to that, I don't find it a particularly compelling argument that can really hold much water. It's not really delivering a huge amount of business value, and I'd rather see an argument that actually tells me what the revenue difference to my company is going to be by implementing these technologies. Another argument I often hear is you must implement it. It's just like email. If you don't, you're going to be left out. Can you imagine a company that didn't use email these days? Again, I think, is that true? I'm not sure that every single company can get value out of every single aspect of social computing. There's quite a diverse spectrum of technologies that go towards making up the social computing landscape, and I'm not sure that they apply equally to every single enterprise. So where is the value? Let's have a look at it from the point of view of those 4 functional areas before. Blogs, I think, have got a very good place to play in terms of corporate communications, but not just corporate communications. If you look at departmental and project communications, they provide a very good thought leadership way of explaining and generating information for those particular audiences. Wikis are also extremely valuable at a similar set of levels, at a corporate level, at a project level, and at department level, for providing multi-user content generation. I've seen it used on IT projects very effectively, where they'll build up the information about the project so that new members coming onto a project team have got an easy means of accessing the information rather than necessarily wading through a set of Word documents or PowerPoint diagrams to understand what's going on. Social media, I think, is one of the areas where there is a lot of room for innovation in the enterprise and a lot of value that can be had. We've done, as a company, a lot of work implementing this as a training solution for companies. Companies are looking to reduce costs of training at the moment in the economic climate. And one of the ways we've helped companies do this is by allowing end users to upload their own snippets of valuable lessons that they can share with their colleagues. And this has really delivered a huge amount of benefit to that company and given them a bit more strength. Equally, things like images, being able to give a library of images and adding functionality to it so that you can have sorts of tools for cropping, emailing or including in other applications from a single point of source. And forums and discussions are a very good way of pulling in informal sets of self-help. Building up FAQs via means of community-based discussions is quite a powerful tool. So content, I think, has got a very good place and a very good set of value that it can add within the enterprise. And certainly a lot of the large companies I've seen have implemented blogs and wikis and have seen the return that those can give. Social communities, I think, are an area where we're going to see a lot more investment and a lot more interest over the coming years. And I think the reason for this is that a lot of knowledge is locked up inside people's heads, and finding that knowledge can be particularly tricky. So being able to provide profiling information so that employees can let people know what the skills that they've got are, what they consider themselves an expert in potentially, what projects they might have worked on, which languages they speak, can all help build and shape a view of that person. If you then layer social search alongside that, so being able to then use that information so that you can find those sorts of people within the enterprise, you'll be able to build a much more dynamic set of connections so that people can find experts within the enterprise. Social commentary allows for feedback and really self-tuning of certain information. Ratings, I think the use is relatively lightweight to put rating systems in place, and the benefit is it gives users a viewpoint of how useful another user might have found that particular piece of content. Likewise, commentary adds to that kind of ratings and provides not only a numerical viewpoint of, say, it was really great or it was really poor, but potentially additional content that's coming from the community of users that are using it. And lastly, the tagging or bookmarking has really got a two-way use within the enterprise here. Firstly, it allows for users to say how they would have liked to have found the content, and that can enable other users to find similar content in a similar way. And bookmarking allows people to find information that other people have said that they have an interest in, or if you're like me, to actually remember all of the different information that you're trying to keep a track on. And lastly, social communications. The feeds really provide a way to deal with the information overload that we see cropping up a lot today. And how do you actually keep track on all of the different sources of content and data that exist within an enterprise that you're meant to keep on top of? Unified communications, whilst not strictly, I don't think, part of a social computing, it is very closely aligned. And things such as presence, which enable you to see if a particular user is online, allow you to go and reach out to a member of a community, such as the author of a piece of content, and get clarification or find out further information about a particular topic area.
When you implement enterprise social networking, you're actually adding another place where people have to go to look for information. Is it not a better option to try and make it the only place where you do such and such a thing, and try and replace email, or try and reduce the dependence on email?
So it's certainly an interesting question, and I think that unified communications kind of plays into that, in that I don't think we're going to, certainly not in the short term, going to replace email. But if we look at, certainly in the public space, what Google are doing with things like Google Wave, in terms of looking at, is email, if we invented email now, given what we know, would we come up with the email that we have in front of us, which is pretty rudimentarily simple, but as you say, it's not particularly connected in with the rest of the landscape. I think that's probably an indication of the way that this is going to go. So I don't think we can get rid of email in the short term, but I think we'll see it changing in terms of its place within an organisation.
Just to add to that, with email you can send a message to anybody. They don't have to be subscribers to that particular network that you're on. And one of the problems I find is that I have to be on dozens of different networks, which is actually worse than having one email system where everything comes.
And I think that's one of the problems that we face at the moment, is that whole information overload, even within your own company. There are so many different sources of information, trying to act on and filter out that information into what's actually useful to you is in and of itself quite time consuming. How can you measure the success of this implementation? A lot of CTOs and CIOs and probably even CFOs are looking at these sorts of solutions that are being put into enterprises and asking, well, why are we doing this? What is the value of these solutions? And if you don't have some means of being able to measure the success of that implementation, then you're effectively putting your system up in the firing line for economic cutbacks. Despite the fact that supposedly our economic climate's getting better, I still think that a lot of organisations are still looking to implement cutbacks to ensure that they're in a good competitive situation. One of the ways that we've seen customers look at and measure this success ratio is to look at the number of connections that a person has within their organisation. And typically what we find is before these social computing tools are implemented, people's connections tend to be quite localised. They tend to have a lot of colleagues that are either in the same department or in the same physical location as themselves, and very few connections outside of that. And when we go and measure implementations of social networking that have been successful, we find that suddenly there are connections appearing that cross boundaries. So that may be cross departmental boundaries or cross physical geographical boundaries, and you're finding colleagues that are adding value to a situation that you may never have identified before.
Start talking about investment banking or something, and you socially network to someone between Switzerland and Singapore or something, you could get your company in quite a lot of trouble. So I'm going to raise security and see how you want to address it. We can park it all.
So the question was around, particularly for organisations where those boundaries are in place for a good reason, and Chinese walls, for example, have been put in place to prevent communications. How do you address that sort of problem? To be honest, I don't work in the investment banking world, so it's not a problem that I personally have seen or come across before. And I'm pretty sure it's not that you shouldn't be talking to your counterpart in another part of the organisation. It's what you shouldn't be talking to your counterpart in another part of the organisation about that's probably more important.
I've worked in investment banks and they don't even allow a office communicator or anything for that very purpose. Because what you shouldn't be talking about is what you're working on, because it would potentially transfer information about bids and things outside of.
It's not something I've got a response to, but certainly something we can discuss at a later point. Other ways of measuring success and looking at it are particularly simple. So using surveys to really go and ask the users the questions and gathering feedback to determine success. There are other means of understanding whether a solution has been successfully implemented and what the value and difference it's made to their life. And this probably comes some way to addressing what you just raised there in terms of security.
Talk there about measurement being the criteria, the level of networking being means into itself, and being able to show that justifying the investment. It occurs to me that social networking can offer some added value to the business, which can actually be measured in pounds and dollars. Things that can be done using social networking techniques that perhaps couldn't have been done in a previous enterprise. And it's interesting that the experience and actually justifying on proper business outcomes achieved through using these techniques would likely be possible.
That's more of a point rather than a question, I guess.
I'm just interested in the experience and seeing organisations justify the investment on the back of actually achieving some measurable benefits that wouldn't have been achieved in the previous generation.
I can't give it any off the top of my head, and it's difficult to get tangible. Quite a lot of time, it's difficult to get tangible, real business benefits coming off the back of some of these types of solutions. Certainly some of the reducing time to market for a company is sometimes seen as a way of maintaining competitiveness, but it's difficult to actually measure the value of, because we were able to socialise and get to a solution quicker, what the actual value was from that is sometimes difficult to express.
Sorry, can I just say, my experience of deploying social networks in enterprises is where we've done it for organisations that would typically have sales conferences on a monthly basis, and they'd fly everybody into one location. You know, you instantly save large amounts of money by using the collaboration technology that's available. You still have occasional get-togethers, but you can reduce it, and you can significantly justify that on the bottom line.
And that's more along the unified communications lines, when you're using video conferencing or voice conferencing, in addition to whiteboarding type applications as well.
Yeah, and making technology available so they can share on a sort of an ongoing basis, really.
And we claimed all these benefits years ago with collaboration technologies. Are we going to be claiming them all again?
I think that IT itself is generally a recursive in terms of the technology platforms. So I've heard some people say that really a lot of the social computing technologies is just groupware under a different name. So a lot of the benefits that people would have attributed to those kind of solutions are equally attributable to these. I think they're just amplified a little bit more in terms of their applicableness and the number of scenarios they can apply to.
What happened to groupware? It was around sort of 20 years ago. It was just the up-and-coming thing, the solution to life, the universe and everything. What happened to it? What happened to Lotus Notes, for instance?
I know that there are certain people that, as this gentleman said, still use Lotus Notes and still swear that it is the best thing since sliced bread. Some people I know that use Lotus Notes that are very adamant and don't like to drop it. I think, and certainly as I was actually reading an article on this last night, I think one of the problems was that it got overhyped, and the term groupware, everyone just said, yeah, what we do, this is groupware, and this is groupware. And so it almost became a meaningless term. And I guess there's a danger that social computing and social networking could fall foul of a similar overhype and overperception. And really, I think that's why you need to consider what the actual business value is, rather than just saying, yeah, everyone else is implementing these social computing tools, we should implement them too, without having a good idea of, are they right for my workforce and my business at the current time. So, looking at policies and governance, it's pretty important, I think, to implement these. And this has a lot to do with how much trust do you have in your workforce. Can you trust people to not make the connections that they, because of some legislation or compliance reason, shouldn't be making? Or do you actually need to enforce that within the IT systems themselves? Policies can be either automated or they can be verbally communicated. Within Avanade, we've got a blogging policy, for example. And this states exactly what we should and shouldn't be blogging about. If I were to go out into a public blog and state what my company's strategic direction was for the next 3 years, I think my company would have some recourse to come back to me and probably ask me to take it down. Likewise, what I say internally equally needs to have policies built around it. I can't be saying things that from an HR perspective could be defamatory to another of my colleagues. So you need to think about how you go about implementing these tools and what impact it has on your workforce and on any local legislation that may be in place. You also need to consider the governance of the tool set that you're implementing. Who's got a vested interest in this technology and should be contributing to the ongoing running of such a solution? Personally, I'm generally in favour of not rigidly enforcing this. I think it goes against certainly the ethos of these systems. If you try and put in place an IT system that filters out certain words, people will find ways of working their way around it if they really want to express that kind of idea. So I think it's better to treat it at a cultural level and either put in place controls or people that are responsible for maintaining the quality of the content that's going into the system, or allowing peers to feed back so that they can report content that they believe is inappropriate and should be taken out of the system, and raising that up to a higher level as well. The next area that I want to talk about is, if you're a company, and I think this particularly pertains to brand-oriented companies, which a lot of companies are, is there's a lot of information out there on the public internet which relates to the perception of your brand in the marketplace. People blog about things and may mention your brand as part of that blog, either in a very positive or a very negative light. They may compare you to another brand, and that's a particularly powerful source of information within a particular demographic. And particularly because when you get that information, you've not only got information about your brand, but potentially a bit of profile information that you can use as demographics on the people that are generating it. Not sure if there's anything illegal about doing that. I think if people are going to stand up and make a viewpoint on something and put it out on a public blog or express it via Twitter or any of those other public tool sets, then that's information about your brand that you can use to determine your position in the marketplace. And the problem is, how can you keep a range on that? If I went out and did a Google on my brand and said, I want to go and find out who's been talking about it on Twitter, I'd get a huge amount of response to it, and manually going through and crawling that information by hand, I think is a task that for most large brands is insurmountable. Things like search engines can help that. So search engines that can go out and pull information from those information sources, and particularly if they can understand the semantic intent that's behind the association of your brand with any particular piece of content, can be used to automate that pool of data and feed that into your general information that you've got. Like I said, it is generally, you're going to have to bear in mind the demographics that give it. It's not going to give a full viewpoint of your brand perception in the marketplace, but certainly for brands that are consumer oriented, I think it can deliver a lot of value. The other area is looking at this, using people to do your work for you and using your brand loyalty to drive adoption. Most of you have probably seen adverts on the internet for things like this, or adverts on the tube, where people like T-Mobile, in this example, are actually actively using their audience to actually generate their marketing for them. And that has a lot of value for those brands. Their audiences that they're generating for are going to be much more trustworthy of content that is coming from their peers than necessarily a set of marketeers who are just using a set of actors to target their audiences. So I think we'll see a lot more of this kind of social advertising coming forward in the next few years.
How do we know that there aren't people out there who are being paid to blog about, a particular company either favourably or unfavourably?
There certainly are, and there's I can't remember the term for it off the top of my head.
Sock puppets, aren't they?
Yes, and quite often though, they get found out. So particularly you'll find that people working in a marketing department have generated a number of aliases and posted them on public websites to promote their own brand. Quite a lot of the time they're not being particularly clever about this, and the way that people are finding them out is they use the same text, or the style of the wording is the same as the style of the wording that they used for their own marketing, and they get found out. Now people are going to start getting cleverer about this sort of thing, so certainly it's difficult to pick up on at the moment, and it's potentially going to get more problematic. So I guess the lesson is, don't necessarily believe everything that you read that is trying to put something in too positive a light out on the internet.
It's actually against the law now to post on the internet information about your company if you work for that company and not declare that you work for that company.
There has been precedents set. There's been court cases where people have been.
Now that say you cannot do that. So certainly, people that have been doing that have hopefully stopped, and people that they should be aware that you have to declare that you work for the company.
Unfortunately, the only problem is that that's a UK specific law. It's not a international law that's been passed, as far as I'm aware.
It's European.
It's European.
But I think there's similar regulations and legislation in the US that covers it as well.
So there's an application called Foursquare that you can use on your mobile phone. Restaurants are offering you 10% off if you go into the restaurant and say, "Great pizza here." So it's out there and it's happening all the time.
Picking up on your earlier slide where you were saying about the analysing the data and for your brand. I mean, there are products out there, they call them listening post technology, so Intensity and Buzzmetrics and Radian 6, and they do analyse, they do what's called sentiment analysis, so they pull in all the feeds from screen scraping, from Twitter, from Facebook, from everywhere, and then make an analysis and say there's a positive sentiment or a negative sentiment about your brand here.
So if we look at some of the technology platforms that are out there in the marketplace, I've kind of split this into two halves. First half is looking at the major vendors. And by major vendors, I mean people that are likely to be providing some or majority of a company's existing applications. Microsoft at the top, no bias there from my point of view. They've just launched their latest SharePoint platform. And they've made a lot of investment in social computing as part of that platform. And one of the things that I think they've got right, and I think IBM have also got this right, is the way that that's pervasive throughout the rest of their product set and integrated into the rest of their product set, so that when you purchase more products from them, they all start taking advantage of the technologies and capacities of that platform. So Lotus from IBM have now got their Lotus Connections platform, and again integrated into multiple points of the IBM stack, from WebSphere to some of the Lotus clients as well. It's got some of those analytical capabilities. I think they're more internal analytical capabilities rather than externally facing analytical capabilities, but certainly something that gives you perception of how their products are being used within a social computing perspective. Both Microsoft and IBM also provide cloud-based offerings of their solutions as well. OpenText is another example. They're effectively grown into this market by acquisition. They bought Vignette out a couple of years ago, and it's giving them a bit of an advantage, but I think they've got a rather large product suite, and actually integrating it into that product suite is proving somewhat of a challenge for them at the moment. And Oracle, they've got a Beehive product, but I think they're really lagging behind the rest of the field here. They're really trying to play catch up, and given the pace of change in this technology space, there's every chance that they may do that and do a leapfrog at some point over the next year or two. But at the moment, I don't think they've got a particularly compelling solution set in this space. If we look at the specialist vendors in this space, there's an awful lot of these. So again, I've just picked 4 to give you an example. Jive are probably the biggest of those specialist vendors that have got a product that's out there and is being actively used by enterprises. Got a pretty large customer base and pretty wide in terms of the application functionality and the range of social computing applications that form its product suite. Telligent are a Microsoft pure play. They're actually set up by an ex-Microsoft person. I think their challenge that they've got is actually differentiating themselves from SharePoint over the next few years. But they do have an analytics product that does some of that analytics of external systems and gathering that data for you. Atlassian are one of the vendors that made their name on wikis, but their core product is a wiki product. They don't have much that really differentiates themselves, and they haven't really extended that too far out from that core wiki product at the moment. And lastly, Google. I mentioned Google way before Buzz as well, really looking to shake up the marketplace. Their Google Docs application as well is particularly compelling in terms of its collaborative authoring and having multiple people to work on content as well. But they're struggling to get large enterprise adoption. They've got a few large enterprises, but they're struggling to really get that scale in terms of their applications. So I already mentioned that Microsoft and IBM, as examples, are providing their services not only as on-premise based services, but also in the cloud. And people like Google, as well as more niche players like Yammer and Presently, who do applications that are more like Twitter for the enterprise, are providing cloud-based services. And I think companies to look at these very seriously. The cost savings in terms of implementing solutions from these vendors is quite compelling. However, you need to really consider things like the identity of the users. How can you make sure the identity of the users, security, which got mentioned before, becomes an even more of an issue when you look at hosting this outside of your own data centres. And that last point is, should your users really care where the service is? A lot of companies host their applications out of a third-party data centre already. Does it really matter that they're a cloud-based data centre for some of these application types?
We've got, 40,000 employees worldwide, and we've got 3,500 of those active on Yammer. And that's nothing to do with the corporate at all. That was set up by a colleague, information is spread, and it's being used. So as and when we bring Twittering type stuff in with SharePoint 2010, I suspect we won't use it because we'll stick with Yammer. So you can't really control that sort of thing that's outside and people got access to.
And it's difficult, and I think certainly things like Yammer, I was speaking to Simon the other day and he mentioned that a lot of what goes on in Yammer is mindless babble, similar to what goes on Twitter. It's not really adding value, and what value, therefore, is it that you've got these applications being used anyway? Is it actually delivering any business value using these sorts of things?
Well, we've still got the free service, we're not even paying for it, so it's, yeah.
So you're not paying for the service,
Not paying
your employees spending their time babbling on at each other about meaningless, I got chips for lunch kind of conversations. So a lot of companies are blocking access to things like Facebook, Twitter, and so forth for their employees. And I do find this somewhat strange thing, is the sorts of people that are using this are the sorts of people that will probably just go and access it via their mobile phones and spend their time doing it anyway. So let them do it through their desktop PC, and they'll actually be more productive at doing that and hopefully get it done quicker and get back to their day job anyway. So a lot of what these public platforms provide is actually of use to you if you're building applications of your own. So if you go and look at these, a lot of these will actually provide one or more access points and access to the data within their applications. So Facebook, for example, provides access to what it calls the Graph API, which uses JSON for its access point. Both LinkedIn and Yammer use the open authentication mechanism for you to authenticate into the system and pull data out about it. And they both support REST-type APIs for getting that data and leveraging it and using it within your own applications. So it's just a checkpoint that if you are going to want to use these services, is to make sure the service you want to use is actually going to be consumable by your own applications, so that if you do want to extend them or get access to the data within them for your own purposes, you can do at some point. So the last thing I'll look at in this section is really looking at the architectural impact of some of these things, and we've kind of touched against some of these already. From a business architecture perspective, really, I think we should be trying to align these sorts of solutions with what our business strategy is. Now, if our business strategy happens to be that we want to increase the number of staff we're maintaining at a very youthful level, and our competitors are attracting them with more modern tool sets, then that may be a viable reason why we want to implement some of these things. I'm not particularly sure about that. Or we want to introduce the training capability where we introduce peer-to-peer training and reduce training costs overall. That may be a valid strategy to tie on and implement solutions on backward. And it means that we can tie these systems that we're implementing back up the value chain and make sure that our IT systems are aligned to our business. A lot of what's going on in terms of hopefully enterprise architecture in general anyway. In terms of the information architecture, so our data and our application architecture, we need to consider things like data security around this. So again, we mentioned about controlling access connections between borders if that's relevant. So data security may have a place to play. And looking at data structures, if we look at things like tagging and bookmarking, who's got ownership of this tagging? Do we let people use free-form tagging? Do we want to control that, or do we want a kind of blended model where we have a corporate tagging taxonomy and let people augment that with our own additional elements? But who's going to control those? Who's going to manage those over time?
If somebody is a known subject matter expert, their ranking would be more influential than somebody else, as an example.
So I certainly think it's one of the areas where there's a little bit of lacking at the moment, in that there's a lot of what we see at the moment is associations between people, but we've got no idea and measurement of those associations. They're just that I happen to be connected to you, and you might say I'm your manager, but it doesn't give you any much more value other than that. There's no real semantic relationships that most of these tools are implementing that I've seen at the moment.
Isn't that exactly what Amazon does? Oh, sorry, not Amazon, eBay, in that it rates buyers and sellers, and all you're describing is rating information providers. So like LinkedIn, for example, in the answers section has, best answers by, so it's a way of rating.
I just haven't seen any of those implemented from the perspective of relationships or ratings at the moment. And then how do you determine who is authoritative for saying his answer is more important than his answer. And then at the infrastructure architecture, there's lots of new capabilities. As you said, departments may have pressed ahead and gone and implemented and gone on access services either free over the internet or purchased them. And because there's such a rate of change and such a fast-paced rate of change going on with these technologies at the moment, that a lot of people are just going, our IT department's too slow, we're just going to go and pick some of these services up from the internet. So some of the companies that I've gone into, we've had to pull wiki content in from their public wikis that they've been using to date in order to get that content accessible and available via the corporate wikis. And part of the infrastructure is obviously that cloud sourcing. Should you be using cloud sourcing, and if so, what are the implications? So I've only got a few slides left. So look at the futures of social computing. So I think social computing is going to continue at a fast pace, and if I could predict what the next big Twitter was going to be, I probably wouldn't tell you, and if I did, I'd probably be quite a rich man and probably wouldn't be standing here anyway. But I think it is going to continue at a relatively fast pace, and we'll see innovations and ideas coming up and turning into large platforms in a quick space of time. I think there's a lot within the marketplace in terms of consolidation. There are literally hundreds of specialist vendors providing tools in both the public and the enterprise domain to meet some of these social computing needs. Some of them, like Vignette, have already been snapped up, but there's a large number of vendors that I think are either going to get squeezed out or bought up by one of the other players in the marketplace. I don't think there's a very large number of standards out there in terms of these, so I don't see any real standards in terms of profile exchanging. RSS seems to be about the only standard that seems to be widely accepted for feeds. So I think we might see some additional standards being brought up and introduced to help interoperability of these sorts of tool sets, so that competitive tool sets at least can be integrated easily. Speaking to some of our customers, I see that there's a lot of potential for some of these social computing to be used not just within the enterprise, but also with partners. So you see a little bit of it, so publishing blogs out to a select audience of your partner. I think we can probably see a lot more in terms of using intercompany wikis to share information about partnerships, and particularly on projects where you might have vendors from a number of different organisations taking part, using some of these technologies to quickly build relationships between your partner networks. I think will give a lot of value. And that last thing, I think, is that introduction of those semantics for social connections. I think hopefully we'll see a lot of tools come up that will allow us not just to say, I am related to you, but how I'm related to you, and a quantification possibly of the relationship of those connections and the data associated with them. So, should we be considering this for businesses? I think at the moment, on the plus side, there are things that can deliver very definite value and show your company's differentiation in the marketplace. And certainly some of the tool sets are large enough to deploy at an enterprise scale. So certainly the Microsoft, the IBM and the OpenText tool sets, to name some of them, are certainly at a maturity level now where they're certainly stable enough and ready for that level. But it's still in flux and change is rapid, and this is really a kind of balancing point. The major vendors can't move quickly enough to keep up with these technology paces. Their versions get released once every 2 or 3 years, and that's just not fast enough to keep pace with the technology change in this area. One of the things that may change that is the wider adoption of the cloud-based services, where the vendors have got an opportunity to do much more frequent release cycles and really get that functionality out into their users' hands. But the small vendors, I think, are still able to respond a lot quicker. So I think even though we'll probably see acquisition of a number of them, they're still able to provide niche solutions to certain enterprises. So thanks very much for your time. If there's any further...
Okay, well, one of the challenges, as I said, social computing within an organisation, whether that's a company or the BCS, for example, is adoption of the thing. It's not the technology, we can get it to do things, it's getting people to do it, to build up momentum. Okay, because if you haven't got the momentum of people using it, it's going to fail. You were talking at the beginning about value proposition for small and medium enterprises. I was curious if you have a feel for how big the enterprise has to be in order to ensure a degree of adoption. Because the thing I've been surprised by lately, an example, the BCS has its own internal social networking environment with, in theory, 70,000 people, and doesn't seem to get used very much. You compare that to LinkedIn, of which there are various BCS member groups, much smaller membership size, but the interaction on that seems much higher. I just wondered if you could offer some guidance.
I certainly think that it's a really good point that adoption is key to the success. The social media training that I mentioned before, about 2/3 of the budget wasn't on the technology. It was on actually making sure that there was a critical mass of content being submitted by the correct people to ensure that there was enough to keep that ball rolling. Because if they hadn't taken that approach, then the solution would have slowly dried up. And I think there's no hard and fast ruling here. It depends on what aspect of the toolset that you're looking at. Things like wikis I've seen work really effectively on small project teams of 10 people. And if it can work on a small project team of 10 people, there's no reason why it can't work in any company. Expanding social networks, if you've only got 100 people in your company, well, there's only a limit to the size of the social network that you're going to build within that company anyway, so why go and implement a tool set for something that doesn't really need it? So I think it's, again, look at each aspect of this platform that you're trying to implement and determine, is it of value to my organisation? Will the tool set get used? And what do I need to do to engage my user community? Finding champions that you know, for example, if you're going to implement a blogging platform, finding someone who loves to talk about what they're doing as a champion and someone who people always turn to for advice anyway, is a good way of seeding those kind of projects with the correct amount of content.
I'm wondering around the use of the brand loyal audiences that you have the T-Mobile example, and using them as sort of marketers rather than actually professional marketers within a particular organisation. Have you got an example where that's actually contributed to either company profitability, revenue, any way to the bottom line, or is it just kind of nice to have? Let's have a little chat.
Something like that, I don't think it's contributing to the company's bottom line. What it's doing is taking cost out of something that you would have previously had a cost associated with. YouTube, to all intents and purposes, is free for T-Mobile to use. Now, they've actually, I think, paid YouTube a license fee because they've got a site that's hosted within YouTube, but I'm pretty sure that's lower than the cost that they would have had to have a formal advertising production put in place. Much as I might be annoyed by that T-Mobile music person, it's done a world of good for them in terms of their perception within that particular target audience.
I think there's some very clear examples of it working the other way. I don't know if anybody ever saw the employees at Pizza Land stuffing pizza up their noses. It was viewed by millions of people on YouTube. They then spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to rectify that situation. So it clearly does build your brand, it clearly can build your reputation, but it can also take it down in an instant. So I think some of the measurable impacts are where it's had a very negative effect on a brand or a reputation, but which have clearly been very easily measured because they've seen a massive drop in revenue.
Can I ask, amongst your blue chip clients that you work with, how many of them have actually implemented social media solutions based on a positive ROI, i.e. they see value or predicted value by the implementation? And as a flip to that, how many have implemented based on experimentation? So, for example, research and development into how these solutions can add value to their organisation.
There's not a lot of companies that have actually implemented that kind of YouTube-like implementation so far. And I think the primary reason for that is that it's not a lightweight implementation. If you're implementing video streaming across your own network, there's a lot of implications in terms of bandwidth consumption, network storage and so forth. So there's not a huge number of ones that I can point to. The two that I've seen, the one, the social learning, definitely did have a ROI, and I think it was a 6-month ROI that they calculated in terms of the study that they did. The other company I've seen that has implemented it, I think did it just as an experimentation and as a corporate delivery. And I think because they were a large global company, they wanted to have a vehicle where their CEO's voice was heard through all levels of the company, and they were willing to invest that money to see what the effect of using that was. They were a company at the time that had plenty of revenue to burn. So.
Can I ask whether you have any experience with the virtual worlds. I think the trend is now moving from sites like Facebook to three-dimensional environments like Second Life. Do you have any experience or examples that you can give us on that?
Not within the enterprise space. Not sure if anyone else here has got any.
I've heard of companies using Second Life for recruitment.
Yes, some major charities are also using them to gather supporters and get people to engage in maybe their client base. Say a disability charity trying to set up people in Second Life with advertising their desires for themselves, and then to get people engaged in that and donate.
But if there aren't any more questions, I'd like to thank Steph again for a whirlwind tour across the landscape of social networking, and done with great expertise, and thank you very much indeed. It takes a lot of time to prepare a talk like that, and also takes a lot of courage to come and speak to a well-informed audience such as yourselves. Steph, thank you very much indeed.